Good morning, everyone. I'm Genevieve Eason of Wilton Youth Council. And together with our partner, SpedNet Wilton, I'm happy to welcome you to our webinar, Mindful Parents, Mindful Families, Effective Parenting in Trying Times. This morning, we'll be hearing from Tracey Masella, a licensed clinical social worker with a private practice in Wilton. Tracey worked at Silver Hill Hospital for many years and now works with the hospital in community outreach and education. And our thanks to Silver Hill for sponsoring this presentation. I'm going to put the links to all of our websites in the chat, so be sure to visit them later, not while you're watching Tracey, but for more information. Wilton Youth Council programs are for informational purposes only, do not constitute medical or psychological advice, and are not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We do want you to ask questions during the webinar, so please enter your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and then every now and then Tracey's going to pause and see if there's any questions, and I will read your questions to her. You're also going to see I'm going to add a link to an evaluation form in the chat, and we hope that you'll click it and open it up, and when the webinar is all done, you'll quickly just zip through it and give us some feedback. We'd love to have your feedback. So Tracey, I'm going to hand it over to you. We're excited to hear you speak this morning. Thanks for being here.
Perfect. Thanks everybody for being here. I can't see you. I know you can see me. I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me. But I want to thank Genevieve and Carrie Ann and all the wonderful, wonderful people that work on the Wilton Youth Council. I've had a joyful, long association with the council, and I'm always happy to speak to you. And my practice is here in Wilton, so I feel connected to your community in a bunch of different ways. So thanks for being here on this somewhat gloomy day. We are heading into a season which is both joyful and trying. So I think this is a good time to think about how we can be more mindful as human beings, right? Not just parents, not just partners or spouses, not just siblings or kids, but how as human beings we can be more mindful in these times. So, all right, so let's get going. So here's our families these days. These are very, very trying times. We see statistics every day in newspapers, online, on the television, about how there's been a rise in anxiety and depression, stress, people feeling overwhelmed with everything that's going on. It's very, very difficult for us as humans to have so much uncertainty in so many areas of our life. We don't like that. It creates a hypervigilance and often results in us acting in problematic ways just to get out of that feeling of fear, anxiety, discomfort. So the silver lining is that we're all going through it together, and part of being mindful is just acknowledging the reality of our world right now, and not trying to run away from it or fight the reality of it, but really accepting where we are. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. I always like to start with just a brief overview of how our brain works in a very, very simplistic way. But the two main areas of our brain that are part of our emotional experience are the amygdala, which is way, way, way back here in our midbrain. It's a very primitive part of our brain that develops very quickly and is fully operational by the time we're little itty bitty bitty people. We often call it the feeling brain, because it is very reactive to any stimulus, both external stimulus or internal stimulus. And the goal of the amygdala, the job of the amygdala, is to keep us alive. So it's always scanning our environment for anything that might be life-threatening or dangerous, also anything that might be pleasurable, right? Because we need both of those things. We need to stay out of danger, and we need to have pleasure and joy to stay alive. So that's the amygdala's job. It's kind of the gatekeeper of the brain. It's the first part of our brain that gets activated by something in the environment that triggers it, okay? The next part of the brain that gets involved in the emotional experience is this part of our brain here, the prefrontal cortex, which is what we call our thinking brain. This is where our executive function is, right? Planning, organization, logic, reason. This is our thinking brain, like the CEO of the brain. And most of us know that the brain, this part of our brain is not fully developed until we're 25 or 26 years old. And that is both male and female brains, right? If there's any neuroatypicality like ADHD, anxiety, or depression, that affects the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. So something to keep in mind as well if that's a struggle for anybody in your family. So what happens is the amygdala gets triggered by something in the environment or a thought inside. So both internal and external things can trigger the amygdala. It sends all of this neuronal information to different parts of our body, activates this system. And that's what we call our feelings, right? So our body reacts in different ways. Our eyes might tear up. Our muscles might tense, our stomach does a flip-flop, our temperature might rise, our heart starts to race. All of these things are activated by the amygdala because the amygdala says, pay attention. There's something going on in the environment. And that's where that fight, flight, or freeze reaction comes from, the amygdala, right? Because in very primitive times, you had to react to those things very quickly because life-threatening things were quite real. These days, thankfully, there aren't actual life-threatening things on a daily basis for most of us that are watching this, thank God. But what happens with anxiety is that we turn regular fear into life-threatening situations. That's what anxiety does. It sort of hijacks that fear experience and makes it into an irrational experience. It hijacks the brain. So once we get all those feelings, then that trigger hops over to the prefrontal cortex. That lights up and says, oh, wait a minute, what's going on? Something's going on out here. And we start to think about, or what we call interpret, this emotional experience, right? And how we think about it or interpret this emotional experience is either going to turn the temperature up or turn the temperature down on that emotional experience, right? So our thoughts really regulate the intensity of our emotional experience. And I think that's important to know because part of being mindful is being able to discern how are we thinking about a situation and how are we feeling about a situation, right? And those are often two different things, right? So sadness to me, which is the feeling, the emotion, might have thoughts of, fond memories or, that person is important to me. Sadness for another person might mean I need to not be here anymore, or I need to do something to stop this pain. It's unbearable to me, right? So how we think about or interpret an event and how we feel about it are completely unique to our individual person. The emotional or the feeling reaction is pretty hardwired. We really can't control how our amygdala responds. We can control our thoughts. That is the gift that we are given as human beings, is that we have complete control of where we spend our thought time. And that is the basis of mindfulness, okay? Where we choose to spend our thought time. And the concept of mindfulness is we are spending our thought time in reality in this moment. We're not thinking about what's happening next. We're not thinking about what happened 2 days ago. We are fully present in this moment and basing it on reality. What can we see, feel, hear, touch, smell? Okay. So keep in mind that part of the thoughts being important in our emotional experience as it relates to mindfulness. Okay. So one thing I wanted to note was that kids are kids. Okay. And kids are capable of intellectual capacity at an early age. However, in an emotionally charged experience, the feelings or the impulse is going to win over. Okay, so that's why kids often act erratically, even though they're capable academically, right? Our kids are academically more proficient at an earlier age than certainly my generation, right? So they have that intellectual or academic capacity, but in situations where it's emotionally charged, the amygdala takes over and they usually act on impulse as opposed to reason. Okay. And they're not aware of that because that's just what's going on in their brain. So I often had the experience with my kids of saying, what were you thinking when you did that? And they would say, I don't know. And that's true. They're not trying to brush it off. They really don't know because they didn't access the thinking part of their brain. They relied totally on impulse control and how they felt about a situation. Okay. Any questions about the brain before we move on to another part of the emotional experience? Any questions so far?
Not seeing any questions yet, but folks, don't hesitate to type your questions into the Q&A as they come to you, okay?
Please do. Please do. Love to respond to questions. Okay. So this is what happens in emotional situations in families, okay? And this happens from a very, very early age. Somebody, let's say the kid, will become emotionally aroused. The kid will then look to the parent for validation. And what validation means is, please let me know that you understand on some level what I'm thinking, feeling, or doing, right? I need to know that it makes sense to you. And kids from babies need this validation, right? They need consistent validation from a caregiver to say, you're crying, it makes sense, and I'm going to take care of you. I understand why you're crying. Okay, it makes sense. That's how we develop a sense of trust in our own emotional experience. So we will reach out for validation to someone in the environment. If the environment responds with effective validation, and we're going to go into the steps of validation in a bit, but if we effectively let that person know or that child know that we understand, it makes sense to me why you're sad, it makes sense to me why you're angry, that emotional arousal will go down. And at that point, you can move into problem solving if problem solving is needed, right? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes all people need, sometimes all kids need is to just be understood, okay? Just to be validated, all right? But oftentimes, an emotional arousal that leads to this request for validation is met with ineffective validation. And there's a lot of reasons why this happens. It's hard for us to see our kid or our spouse or a friend in emotional distress, right? It activates stuff in us. So we have to kind of be doing two things at the same time. We have to be managing our own emotional experience and validating the other person's, right? That's a lot of work, right? And we often get caught in the trap of feeling like we need to problem solve right away. Like we've got to get to whatever it is that made this person upset and we've got to fix it. Especially as parents, we do this all the time and it's such a trap, right? Because we don't even know necessarily what the problem is. And we'll start to problem solve and the kid will say, or the spouse will say, or the friend will say, well, you don't understand. And that's true because we haven't given the validation. We haven't said, I understand. And the step after validation is, how can I help, right? But let's go back to that ineffective validation. What might that look like? So ignoring or dismissing the emotional response, right? This is like, just stop. Would you just stop? Enough already. You're too sensitive. Why are you reacting this way? It's no big deal. You got a bad grade on the test? Listen, there's lots of other tests. Or, well, you didn't study and this is what happens, right? These are the things that we say often in a flip way, often when we're overwhelmed, stressed, tired, aggravated, when, especially if you have highly emotional kids where their emotional or their need for validation is maybe higher than other kids. You might have kids that have different emotional needs. That's very often the case in families. Rarely does everybody have exactly the same emotional profile in a family. So all of these things that we do sort of not even thinking, right? Mindlessly, these kind of flip comments that we don't even think about make the person that's requesting validation or seeking validation feel invalidated. And that actually drives up the emotional intensity. Okay, so they start to feel like, oh my gosh, well, this person doesn't understand. Nobody understands. This is all me. What's wrong with me? You know, maybe I shouldn't feel this way, but I do feel this way. What am I supposed to do with all this? So this, you know, this revs up the dysregulation, the emotional experience. And the person will then need to seek other ways to get validation. And often that's in a problematic way. That's when you'll see the tantrums, or in some extreme cases, you'll see self-harm, acting out in other ways, right? And then finally, the environment will respond and give the person the validation they need. But that whole cycle of ineffective validation is damaging to families, because it wears you out. You get frustrated and you feel like, as a parent, the kid is manipulating you to get what they want, when in fact, what they want is to be understood. So two different experiences in the request for validation. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
So we did get a question. It's
All
not
right.
well, it's not about that exactly, but it is.
All right.
It's, can we do anything to sort of, in quotes, train the kids to use the thinking part of their brain?
I guess my question would be, in emotional situations, or because they're using their thinking part of their brain throughout every minute of every day. It's just that they will default. You know, I worry when I hear that, that we want our kids to be less emotional, because again, it's not about being less emotional, it's about being able to manage your emotional experience. And that is not necessarily by being more logical. Okay, so nowhere in this request for validation is there reason, logic, problem solving. It's not in it at all. What we need is to be able to manage our emotional experience in a way that drives down the intensity, so that that part of our brain, the thinking part of our brain, can come back online. Because what happens in an emotional situation, and this happens to everybody, not just kids, right? When our brains get too hot emotionally, this part of our brain kind of shuts down, right? It's not, we can't access it. That's when we go to crazy town, right, if you will. It's like if you have too many programs open on your computer, and you just get that, you know, swirling beach ball of doom. It's because the thinking part of the brain, the hard drive, can't really get back online. So you need to lower the intensity of the emotion in order that this part of the brain comes back online, right? And you can absolutely do that. That's emotional intelligence, right? That's emotional regulation. That's the key to successfully navigating our worlds, is being able to manage emotional experiences in a more effective way. And we do that by modeling, and we don't do that by saying, well, you should be more logical, and you know, let's get that thinking part of our brain online. That would lead to a very, you know, ineffective experience. It's about validating first, and then once the emotional arousal goes down, going into problem solving mode. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yes, the person did come back with a clarification that they mean during emotional situations.
Okay, great, great, great.
Now there's another question.
Yeah.
How do we break the dysregulation reaction if, after validating the feeling, the child still revved up and shuts down? How do we lower the intensity of the emotion?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. If what we see is, if you move to this model and you haven't, if this is a new model for you, right? This is something that you're trying, or you're intermittently trying it. If you have an emotionally sensitive kid, they are not going to like this, okay? If a kid has gotten used to you problem solving for them, making it right, not just sitting in validation until they, you know, have to do the work and lower their emotional intensity, you can actually see a burst. So you have to kind of train this behavior, shape this behavior, and expect that the kid is not going to like it at first. So that's why the earlier you can start this, the better, but it's never too late to start this, okay? And particularly as kids move into middle school and high school, it's really, really important as they spend less time with us, kind of managing their life, hopefully, that they are able to manage their emotional experience outside the house. And you don't want to ever, as a parent, be their sole coping skill, okay? That is a dangerous situation for kids to be in, is that the only way they can regulate is by talking to mom or dad, or a sibling or a girlfriend, boyfriend, right? Those are dangerous situations to be in for kids, because that person is not always going to be there, not always going to be effective. So we need to be able to learn how to manage our emotional experience on our own. So developing coping skills. So listen, the kid might have to just sit with the discomfort while you sit there as well. So what you're saying by sitting there and not moving into problem solving is, listen, I know that you can manage this, and I know that I can manage this, and I'm here and I'm going to sit with you as long as it takes. And we're just going to, we're going to sit here until you feel better, right? Until your emotional intensity goes down. The trap that we get into is that if the kid keeps revving up, we finally say, fine, what do you want, right? So there's a period, there's a learning period, there's a learning curve. The kid may not like it. And sometimes you need to talk to the kids when they're not in an emotional state, when they're not dysregulated, and kind of talk about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to move away from, giving in, giving up, capitulating to the dysregulation, right? Hopefully that answered the question. All of this is, any behavior that we have as human beings is a learned behavior, okay? There are very few innate behaviors other than breathing, but that's not even a behavior, that's just a function, right? So if we learned any behaviors, our brains are plastic and we can unlearn them. So never feel like, oh, this is how my kid is, there's nothing I can do about it. All of our behaviors can be untaught, retaught, differently taught, okay? The key to behavioral change is that the person has to be motivated themselves to change the behavior. We don't change behaviors long-term for somebody else. We might do it short-term because there's some reward in that, but long-term behavioral change has to be completely self-motivated. So I have to know that if I change this behavior, right? If I become emotionally dysregulated and can't manage myself, I am missing out on things that I want in my life, relationships, a job, making a team, getting a part in a play, being able to dance well, whatever it is. Personally, I am missing out because of my behavior. That's when I will be motivated to change. Okay, so you have to figure out, and this is what behavioral therapy is all about, is figuring out what motivates this kid, what's the goal, what's the carrot, and how does the behavior that you're trying to extinguish interfere with getting to that goal, right? So every time I have a tantrum, how does that goal go farther and farther away? And how does that goal come closer and closer and closer if I learn to manage my behavior more effectively? Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
No other questions right now.
Those are great questions, by the way. Super. Okay, so let's talk about, I've mentioned, but drilling down a little bit on what is mindfulness. Mindfulness is being present in this moment in a very particular way, paying attention in a very particular way. This is the way to think about mindfulness. Whatever your body is doing, you want your mind to be doing the same thing. Okay, minds are made to wander. That's what our minds do, and it's a lovely, wonderful thing. And I really, I want to put a plug in right now for daydreaming, because especially right now, we focus a lot on imaginative play when kids are little. We need to bring imagination back into our lives, because especially right now when our lives are so unstructured, letting our minds wander and play and be imaginative is just vital right now. Right. So we need to take vacations in our mind, and we need to think about, where we're going to go and what the hotel is going to look like. And we need to just really let our minds play. Having said that, mindfulness is the ability to say, oh, my mind is wandering over there. I need to be focused over here. So I'm just going to bring my mind back. Okay. It doesn't mean that you have to change anything in this moment. It means that this moment is exactly as it is supposed to be, even if it is painful. Okay. But you are fully present and participating in this moment. And it's not about problem solving. Problem solving is all about change, right? Something that's happening is considered a problem and I need to change it. Mindfulness is just saying, here I am, this is what it is, nothing needs to be changed. The goal right now is to be fully present and manage this moment effectively. And possibly in the next moment, then I can move into problem solving, okay? Any questions about that, about the concept? And I want to distinguish between meditation and mindfulness. Mindfulness is very active, right? It's very active. It's allowing our brains to be fluid and being able to manage where we're spending our thought time. Meditation is more about kind of clearing our mind. Wonderful practice, super, super. If you can develop a meditation practice, I think it's a wonderful thing. It's a great thing to teach our kids as well. It's not easy. It's very hard and it takes a lot of practice. Mindfulness takes a lot of practice as well, but it's much more active and it's much more satisfying if we can do it. So these are the basics of mindfulness. We observe, right? We're just noticing. And we're not getting stuck on any particular thought or feeling, right? We're just noticing what's going on internally, what's going on externally, right? And we talk about Teflon mind. A lot of kids don't know what Teflon is, right? We have to think of a new phrase to call that, but that's that concept of, not getting stuck on anything, letting things slide away. And there's lots of ways you can visualize Teflon mind. People use balloons, putting a thought in a balloon and watching it float away, putting a thought on a leaf on a river and watching it float away. It's just about observing. Velcro mind is the opposite of that, and it's getting really stuck on one particular thought. That's what we call the ruminating and perseverating, right? And somebody just can't get past that, can't get past that. That's the opposite of mindfulness, all right? Is that those sticky thoughts that we can't get ourselves out of, right? Describe. This is what I was talking about, is staying sort of reality based, right? What are you observing without interpretation, right? So if you are looking at a picture, and this is a great way to be mindful, is to pull up a piece of art, or go and look at a piece of art in your house, right? And say, describe that to me. And not use those words like, oh, it's pretty, or it's ugly, or it's dark, or it's messy, or it's too simple, or it's too complicated. Those are all non-factual terms, right? So describe to me in very factual terms. So if I couldn't see that picture, I could bring it up in my mind's eye based on what you're telling me, because it's a reality-based description. Okay. So again, just coming into this moment, grounding ourselves, staying in reality, right? The idea of participation is what I was talking about. If your body is doing something, you want your mind to be doing it too, right? This is key when we're, performing in any way, right? So if you're acting in a play and you go out of character, you're going to forget your lines, right? If you're on the baseball diamond and you're thinking about what you're going to have for dinner after the game, those balls are going to go right past you, right? So whatever your body is doing, you want your mind to be doing as well, right? So staying connected, that mind-body connection. A non-judgmental attitude, right? So this is key. Judgment is different than opinion. Judgment is when we categorize things as good or bad, right? And we do this all the time, right? Opinion is if we like something or not, right? So ice cream, right? Saying I don't like ice cream is an opinion. Saying ice cream is bad is a judgment, Okay. And what we don't want to do, we have judgments all the time. We just, again, we want to know and observe and recognize and acknowledge when we're in judgment mind, right? And not make decisions based on judgment. Okay. We want to make decisions based on fact, right? So that's why when we're in that high emotional state, often we get very judgmental. We'll start to blame, you know, this is bad. Why does this have to happen to me? All of that stuff. That's all judgment mind, right? Again, bringing ourselves back down to the facts. What are the facts of the situation? But you can't do that when you're highly emotional. Okay. One mindful, you know, it is, I was reading an article about Martha Stewart, who by the way is 79. I mean, she looks fantastic. It's unbelievable, the energy this woman has, but she always says, like, I can do 4 things at a time and I can do them well. And I only need 3 hours of sleep a night. You know, that's an anomaly that, and most of our minds cannot do multiple things well at the same time. Okay. Our mind, again, is going to default to the pleasurable things over the non-pleasurable things. So if you're, you know, if you've got Netflix on and you're doing your homework, a lot of kids say, well, it helps me to concentrate. Well, that's actually factually not true, right? So you can listen to music that's not going to distract you, but your mind is always going to veer towards that which is more pleasurable, right? It just is. So you can do multiple things at a time as long as your brain is able to prioritize that which is most important, right? And being effective. This is a really, really important skill for families. And being effective means choosing to let go of the need to be right. Okay. Think about arguments that you get into, particularly with your kids. You're probably right. Okay. That doesn't matter if you lose the opportunity to be effective and model effective behavior in that situation. Okay. So often the most effective thing to do is to walk away and pull yourself together and work on your, you know, emotions, and then come back and have a more reasonable conversation. Okay. We very often get stuck on those teachable moments, right? I've got to get this into my kid, right? It's very important. Let me tell you, if by the time your kids are in middle school, those teachable moments are pretty much done, right? And so they learn much more from us modeling the behavior that we want them to exhibit themselves. Okay. So not needing to be right, not needing to be the judge, the jury, you know, the police, the teacher. You need to be the effective modeler of behavior that we want our kids to exhibit. Okay. So all of those come into play in this concept of being mindful. Probably more than you thought mindfulness was, right? So any questions about those elements of mindfulness?
No questions right now, Tracey.
Okay. How are we doing? Are we being mindful? Are we more stressed or less stressed by getting this information? Just throw some things in the chat, right? So sometimes getting this information can cause us to feel stressed because we feel like there's a lot we have to do or we haven't done. So I just want to be mindful of that and know that this is a process. We are all struggling with it. These are very trying times. If you can take one thing away from this, this webinar, what might that be? And how could you just work on that one thing moving forward?
So we do have some comments. Someone said this is a super helpful framework, and someone else said they're feeling less stressed.
Oh,
information is empowering. That's great.
That's good. Well, thank you. That's terrific feedback. And just to acknowledge, if you are feeling more stressed, that's totally normal as well. Okay.
And one more comment for you, hopeful. We can always keep trying this approach, a good reminder. So feeling hopeful.
Yeah. Perfect. That is wonderful. And honestly, I've been practicing DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which is based on the concept of mindfulness. It's a a modality of treatment that was developed in the early 90s by a woman named Marsha Linehan. And she is the guru of mindfulness. And she was one of the first clinicians that actually combined the behavioral change, cognitive behavior therapy with this concept of mindfulness. And it's just a beautiful match for emotion regulation. And I'm Italian, so emotion regulation was never something I was taught in my family. Still to this day, just wasn't taught in my family. So there wasn't an emotion that we didn't like and we didn't want to express in very loud voices with hand gestures, as you can see. So for me, the practice of mindfulness and emotion regulation is a daily practice. And like I said, I was taught DBT back in the early 2000s. So it's something that I work on every day, and there's always hope. There's always hope. And even if you have a bad day, a bad moment, you can come back and say to the people in your lives, that was a really, really, really poor example of how I can be as a human being. Okay. And it's, you know, the sorries, especially with kids, go a really long way. And that speaks to being effective, right? So you may have been right in your argument, but the way you presented it was just so ineffective. I have to do this all the time. I have to put myself in timeouts a lot, especially these days. And then I come back and I can make the repair. And I'm telling you, it goes such a long way with our family members. Okay.
All right, just one more question for you here. A couple of comments, great information. Thanks for doing it. Definitely not making me feel stressed. And this person says they have 2 seniors and this is great information. They still sometimes default to trying to solve all the problems. So this is making them feel less stressed.
Yeah.
And they ask, can you please repeat what DBT stands for?
Yes, dialectical behavior therapy. And I would encourage you to look online. It's a fascinating treatment, and we are blessed in Fairfield County to have several amazing groups that practice are really adherent to the model of DBT. It's quite a rigorous model, and the training is quite rigorous. So a lot of people say they do DBT, and you can dabble in it. But if you really, if it's something that you think would be helpful for your family, there's 2 groups in Westport that are absolutely tremendous clinicians in DBT. So, and Silver Hill uses DBT. That's their primary model. Okay. So mindfulness, validation, right? So what is this thing called validation, right? You might have a kid that says, you're invalidating me, right? So let's talk about what that means, and then you can figure out whether you're being invalidating or not, right? So validation doesn't mean that you agree. It just means that you understand, okay? And that's really important. And when you validate somebody, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to feel better or it's going to solve their problem, but it's going to help them to, again, bring down their emotional arousal because they feel understood, right? So what's happening to them makes sense to somebody else, and that's important to lowering our emotional arousal, okay? Think about in your lives, you know, some people are just innately born to be good validators, and some people are just absolutely terrible at it. And I am here to tell you that my partner of now going on 13 years is probably the worst validator on the face of the earth. He's an accountant, he's Danish, he thinks very logically, and he doesn't even understand the concept of validation. I've had to train him, he's much better at it, but he's not my go-to if I need validation, right? I have other people in my life, thank goodness, that are great validators, and he's okay at it now. But you know, it's kind of like going to the hardware store for milk. You need to know who the people are in your lives that are going to give you what you need in that moment. And it may not be the person that's in front of you, and that's okay. That's not, again, that's not a judgment that they are bad people because they're not good at validating. And we ourselves might not be good at validating. I think we can all get better at it. And as a society, we can get better at it. But just knowing who your people are and who you're going to go to for validation is super, super important. Okay, so what does this mean? We listen to hear and not to respond. if this is the only thing that you take away from this talk and start to practice in your family, in your home, in your community, you will be light years ahead of most people in our society, particularly in the United States. We are not patient or active listeners. We are always formulating our response whenever we are in a conversation. So if we are actively listening, the whole goal, again, is to understand what the other person is saying. So after the person has spoken, our job is to express understanding by just repeating back what it is that they've said, not word for word. You don't want to parrot it. You don't want to be writing down so that you can repeat it back to them. You just want to say something like, so what I hear you saying is that when Susie said that to you, you felt really, really angry. Is that right? That gives the other person the understanding that you are just there to listen to them. It's a beautiful thing. It's a gift. The other thing it does is it gives them the opportunity to hear what it is that they're expressing. And maybe you didn't get it right, or maybe you did get it right and they want to change that because hearing it out loud it's not really what they're thinking or feeling in that moment, right? So it just keeps the conversation going, but the focus is on the person that needs validation, right? So just those two things alone would put you guys light years ahead. And it really, you'll start to see the emotional arousal go down, right? It gets a little bit more complicated as we go on. So really want you guys to think about those two elements, right? Then putting in the feeling word if the feeling hasn't been expressed. So how did that make you feel? Did that make you feel really afraid? Were you afraid when that happened? Now, the person may not have said that. If you know the person well and you're able to sort of intuit what it is that they would feel in that situation, it's nice to bring in the emotional language, the feeling language, right? Because again, if we don't know what we're thinking or feeling in any given moment, it's really hard to know what to do, right? That, information is power. So learning how to tap into that emotional part of ourselves, that feeling part of ourselves, is really important in the regulation of our emotions. So adding that feeling word, and again, being able, if they say, no, I wasn't afraid, what are you, crazy? And you back off that and say, so what did you feel, right? It's all about the other person and making them feel understood, okay? So then there's this concept, what we call normalizing. If what they're experiencing is fairly typical, then you want to kind of say that. Now, kids don't always like when we do this. And it's really dependent on the delivery, right? So what we don't want to say is, oh my gosh, everybody's stressed. Everybody's depressed right now. It's no big deal. You're just like everybody else. Don't worry about it. That's completely invalidating, right? But to say something like, yeah, these are incredibly stressful times, right? I totally get it. I think so. I was just reading this morning how anxiety and depression is on the rise. It was in the New York Times this morning. I get it. So many people are feeling this, right? It's all in the delivery. Now, the key to this is you don't want to validate anything that is not valid, okay? So if they're doing, thinking, or feeling something that is completely invalid, that there's no basis in understanding, then you don't want to validate that, right? So that's an important point. Connecting the dots, right? This is, yes.
Can you tell us and give us an example of what would be something we wouldn't want to validate?
Yeah, so drinking, kids going to parties, everybody does it, right? Well, first of all, everybody doesn't do it. And second of all, that's not a behavior that we want to validate, right? So that is not either a safe or an effective way to manage ourselves in middle school, high school. So you don't want to validate that behavior, even if it is in the person's mind a typical behavior, okay? Self-harm is another, right? It works in the moment, but it's not an effective behavior, and we never want to validate something that is long-term dangerous. Does that make sense? Once we get through all these, I'll tell a story, and it might help you to understand these concepts a little better, but just want to finish these up. So connecting the dots means based on that person's history, it makes sense that they are experiencing this situation in that way, right? So if you've got a really anxious kid, so I use the example of a kid that I worked with for a long time, and when she was in elementary school, she was in a really bad car accident with her mom in the family car, very near to their house, right? So then she turned 16 and it was time for her. She really wanted to get her license, but she was terrified of getting in the car, the family car, in the driver's seat, right? And so we spent months and months and months working on her just sitting in the driver's seat, you know, and then just moving the car from the garage into the driveway. Now, anxiety about learning how to drive, typical, right? Her level of anxiety was off the charts, right? Given her experience and her history, that level of anxiety made sense, okay? So connecting the dots, saying, and it's always great when you can say to a kid, oh, now I remember a couple months ago, this same thing happened. Was this a similar thing? And do you think that there might be some connection here? That blows kids' minds, that you remember actually something that happened to them, right? The concept of I can hold you and your experiences in my mind as well as what's happening to me is a wonderful, wonderful thing, right? Because kids are fairly narcissistic, right? And it takes until about high school where they start to developmentally change from thinking, you know, everything is about them and in their universe, to thinking about themselves as part of a larger group. So this concept that I can hold my experiences and your experiences in the same mind is a really wonderful concept to pass on to kids. The last is just, it's more of a belief that when you're talking to someone, holding in your mind that they are able to manage their emotional experience. We just need to give them the opportunity to do that. And some kids need more skills than others in order to do that. And we need to get those kids the skills. But ultimately, each and every one of us is responsible for managing our own emotional experience. So what we don't want to do is fragilize, right? Make people feel like there's no way that you can solve this problem. There's no way that you can manage this experience. So I need to leap in and take over. It's a really, 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 it's a dangerous message to send to a kid, that they can't manage their own emotional experience and I need to take over. Okay. Our job is to manage our own emotional experience and validate theirs so that they can learn to manage whatever comes their way, right? That's the concept of resilience. Not that you avoid all problems, it's that you learn from those problems and you adapt to a new and effective way of being, okay? So I'll give you an example. I'll try and be quick because I'm mindful of the time and I do want to get through a couple more things before we have to stop. So let's think about, this is a story, this is not a factual story, but let's say that I go into my office one day and there is a huge snake in my office, like not like a little garden snake that snuck in through the window, but like a huge snake. Don't know how this could happen, but let's just say it does, right? Huge, scary, ugly snake, okay? Completely judgmental. I don't like snakes. I leave, I close the door, I leave the building and I call my clients and I say, I can't see you today. There's a huge snake in my office, right? I call the landlord, I call the, Beardsley Zoo, I call animal control, somebody comes, they take the snake out of the office. The snake is no longer in the office, okay? The next day I get to my office and I can't go in the office. I'm too scared. I can't even open the door, right? I check the facts and I know that the snake is no longer in the office. I've got documentation from animal control that they came and they took the snake out of the office and it's now residing somewhere far, far, far away, okay? My fear is understandable, right? I think you guys can all understand why my hesitation at the door is completely understandable, right? If I wasn't able to go into the office that day, even after I checked the facts and knew that the snake wasn't there, like if I had to call my patients the next day and say, I can't go into my office and I can't see you today because there was a snake in my office yesterday, even though it's not there anymore, that is not valid, right? It doesn't match the facts of the situation. So that's the difference. The validation to me comes from somebody saying, oh my gosh, I'd be so terrified to open that door the next day, right? That's validation. Actual behavior of not being able to go into the office is invalid because it doesn't match the facts. Okay. Does that help a little bit to see where validation comes in, understanding?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thankfully, no snakes in the office. Okay. All right. The concept of acceptance. I want to.
Hang on just a second.
Yep.
Back up. So how do you deal with that then is a question that we're getting when someone's feeling
Behavior.
is understandable, but the behavior is not okay.
Right. So that's when you need to do a little bit of exposure. And if this is a chronic thing, then you need some help with this, right? And as a parent, it's really hard to do exposure with your own kid. They're going to push back on it. But if that fear becomes debilitating, right, then that's something that needs to be treated by a professional. But basically what you do is you expose in little ways. There's a whole protocol that we would do. But if you've got a kid that has invalid fears, that's anxiety. That's when we're in the anxiety department, and that needs to be treated, right? Because that's when the fear becomes irrational, right? It's understandable, but if the behavior is keeping you from doing things that you need to or want to do, that's when it becomes problematic and needs to be addressed. Okay, I'm going to skip forward to this concept of developing a family frame. So I want to talk about the functions of a family. Like there are some core functions of being a family unit, and they are taking care of all the members in the family, right? So taking care, basic needs being met. Fulfillment of our roles is really, really important. And having clear role definition is super important for kids as they grow and develop, okay? So you want to make sure that the role that you're playing in the family is appropriate to the developmental stage that you're in, to your abilities, to your needs, to your personality traits, right? This gets back to a little bit of, you know, finding somebody that can validate you, right? If it's not your spouse's personality or strong suit to be able to do that, then you need to find somebody else to do that. It might not be a great idea to constantly be looking to your kid for validation, because developmentally, that might not be appropriate, okay? So knowing what the roles in the family are is really, really important to keeping a family frame. And sometimes it gets messy, especially if you have a non-traditional family. In cases of divorce, this is often an issue because the oldest child might feel like they need to become the partner to the, you know, the parent that they live with, and that's developmentally not appropriate for them. They don't have the skills, they don't have the ability, and they have needs that need to be met as a child, right? So knowing what the roles in the family are is super important to keeping the family frame, okay? Effective communication, right? So that's basically what we've been talking about with validation, is effectively communicating with the people in our family. And this is we need to learn about the emotional life of our kids, because when they reach high school, it's fairly typical that they're not going to talk to you about what's going on. Developmentally, they're moving away from you as their primary kind of touchstone to figure out that question of who am I, right? So identity development is the key developmental phase or job or role in adolescence. And they do that more by venturing away from the family, getting new experiences, new relationships, to begin to develop this sense of self. And that's really important for them to do. And it's really important in times like the pandemic to allow that as much as possible, right? So just because kids who may have launched in a particular way, college kids that are now living back in your home, even high school kids that had, maybe have a job or a relationship, we have to continue to foster in a safe way that independence and that identity development, okay? And that's the tricky part of the pandemic. But just because they're living back in your home or they're living more in your home these days than they had been, 7 months ago, doesn't mean we treat them differently. We really want to maintain whatever developmental progress they had made towards independence, okay? And resilience, this concept of resilience as a family, how are we adapting to this new lifestyle, right? And this is going to come into play a lot over the holidays as we have to make decisions that are not traditional, right? Who are we going to be spending time with? Who are we not going to be spending time with? And as a family, how do we adapt to that and not just focus on what we can't do, but figuring out what we can do to make this, this holiday season as wonderful and joyful and connected as possible. And thinking about the people that we need to take care of, but how can we do that in a safe and effective way, okay? Also want to bring in the concept of rules versus expectations. And rules are based on safety, and these are non-negotiable, right? And everyone in the family should know what the rules are in the family and what the consequences in the are for breaking those rules, okay? Because what you don't want to do is in the moment of crisis when a rule is broken, and it's a safety rule, so that's always brings up a lot of emotional stuff. You don't want to be deciding on the consequences then. Again, way back to the beginning, about an hour ago, we were talking about how that emotional piece takes over and we can't really think logically. That's not the moment that we want to be dealing out or doling out consequences. We want to make sure that that's established before, right? Because kids, our job is to establish the frame. Kids' job is to push against the frame and see where there might be chinks in the armor. So on those non-negotiable things, there's no wiggle room, okay? And that should be known. Where you have a lot of opportunity to negotiate and be flexible and have conversations with your kids is about your expectations. And it's really important that we make sure that our expectations are reasonable and attainable. Again, based on the kid's personality, based on the kid's ability, based on the kid's needs, and based on the kid's developmental stage. Okay, I think we often have very, 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 very high expectation for our kids, and they even if we say just try as hard as you can, they don't have the feeling that that is actually the case. So really sitting down and saying, these are my expectations. This is what I'd like to see happen. This is what I would be nice if it happened, right? So even differentiating between the levels of expectation so that we're not loading up our kids with a lot of pressure because they already feel a tremendous amount of pressure in the school systems that we, love so dearly. So I'm going to open it up now to any last minute questions. I know we're at the 11 o'clock hour. I am here, don't need to leave. So I'm open for questions, but I just want to, for any of you that do have to leave, thank you for coming. And I wish you all good luck and good health.
Thank you, Tracey. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. We have questions about DBT. What happens if DBT therapy doesn't work? And while you're talking about it, can you tell us the names of the two groups in Westport?
Sure. Yeah, so not all therapies work for all people. Um, and again, there's many therapies out there. So I would say that if you uh, are in need of therapy, if a kid is in need of therapy, if a family is in need of therapy, it's kind of like finding the right house. You gotta maybe, try a few on before you find the one that really fits. It's, having the right clinician is a very personal thing. And I would say give something, give a clinician maybe 4 sessions before you make a decision whether it's a good fit or not. And don't stay with a clinician because you think you're going to hurt their feelings. There is no clinician that is worth their degree would be upset if you said, this isn't working for me, I need to find somebody new. When I hear that, I look at it as an opportunity to find that person somebody that is going to be a good fit. Okay. Excuse me. DBT, if it doesn't work, look, you have to know when your kid is ready for therapy. Okay. And just because you know that they need it doesn't mean that it's going to work by dragging them into therapy. It's the therapist's job to build willingness, right? And again, it's all about finding a goal that this kid wants, right? Not like I want my parents to get off my back, right? I want them to stop nagging me about something. That's not a sustainable goal, right? I have to have a goal that this kid is really invested in. So if DBT doesn't work, then try something else. The 2 groups are, they're long names. The one is the Center for Cognitive and Behavioral Health. The other is the Cognitive and Dialectical Center of Westport, I believe. That's the name that I always get wrong. So if you bear with me 1 second, I will use my Google to get you the exact name. Dialectical and Cognitive Behavior Center. And they're both in Westport. If you Google them, they will come up, I promise.
So just Google dialectical behavior therapy in Westport and you'll get the 2 of them.
So one is called the Cognitive and Behavior Cognitive and Behavioral Health. That's one. The other one is the Dialectical and Cognitive Behavior Therapy Center.
Thank you, Tracy. We have another question. Any suggestions for fostering a 9th grader's growth during this pandemic? This 9th grader is complaining that they can't really make friends at school with the mask and social distancing.
Yeah. So I guess I would ask some questions about whether this kid is someone who has had difficulty in the past making friends, or whether this is a unique situation to the safety protocol.
Okay, we'll see if that person, do you want to chime back in either in the chat or in the Q&A with some more details about that situation?
I think that in general, kids still need to seek out after school or outside of the classroom opportunities to connect with like-minded kids. I think it's still important. I know it's much more limited, but I know it is happening. Every school is working really hard. So in the classroom, I think it's hard to make those connections. Because you're concentrating on the class, you got the Zoom thing going on, and you're only there half the time if you're in a hybrid situation, and you've got the mask and the teacher has the mask. So there's a lot going on in the classroom. So what I'm hearing is that connections are being made and it makes sense outside of the classroom. So still finding those opportunities where the kids can go, and at least they know if they're in a club or an organization or a sport, there's that common denominator of we're all here because we like the same thing, and it sort of breaks down that initial worry.
Okay, I don't see a follow-up on that one, but there is a nice compliment for you in the chat in the Q&A. Thank you. You always present relevant information and your delivery is wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I agree, it is. I'm going to say a couple of things while we wait to see if anybody else adds a question. I just want to remind everyone to please fill out our program evaluation at the link in the chat. And I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted both on Wilton Youth Council and SpedNet's website. So if you enjoyed it, share it with your friends. And if you want to come back and reference anything and listen to it again, it'll be there for you. And then let me take a quick look. Oh, let's see. Oh, I think I've got that. Just checking the questions again. And then I did want everyone to know to check everybody's websites for upcoming programs. And one that I want to call to folks' attention is on Monday, November 9th at 11 a.m. We're offering a webinar titled Encouraging Your Teenagers to Find Their Own Paths, a roadmap for choosing a college, a career, or something different. And Rick Fieri will be with us to help us understand how to explore various postgraduate possibilities with our students, recognizing that college isn't the only option after high school.
Amen.
Well, I don't see any other questions right now. Tracey, thank you so very much for this.
Always a pleasure.
I agree that you're always just very fun to listen to, and I learn a lot every time. And so thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who attended and asked questions. We really appreciate your participation.
Very much so. Everybody be well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.